We'll try to interject a few of those videos once in a while because they really bring to life the message that we are going to be focused on as we go through the Gospel of John in this series. But if you have your Bibles, turn to John chapter 2 this morning. John chapter 2. The theme is that miracle of turning water into wine. But there's a lot more going on under the surface of this story that I want us to see. A couple of months ago, I have my cell phone here, and I got this from my daughter, and I had to replace the screen on this. I know it's an old, ancient cell phone. I got the cruddy cell phones in the family. The good ones go to the wife and the daughters. I get the hand-me-downs. But I had to change the screen on that, and I ordered one of those $20 screens and took it off. I didn't want to spend $150 to get an iPhone 5 SE fixed. So took the screen off and did it myself. And I was amazed. I mean, these devices they're fascinating to me, that we get all of the technology that we do in this and how a microchip can do all of that. But when you take these things up, or take the screen off of that, you cannot imagine everything that's underneath this screen and all of just everything that goes into making one of these things work. It's fascinating to me how they can compact that all into this. And this is a thick one compared to what we have today, right? There's so much going on underneath there. We get to see it and we get to celebrate the use of it, but all of the detail underneath that makes that thing work. This passage of Scripture, when I first read it, does this same thing to me. We see the glory, we see the miracle, we see all of that on the surface. But what I want us to see today is there's a lot going on underneath the surface of this story about Jesus and about what this means for our lives today. So as we look at John chapter 2, I want us to be challenged by two things. First of all, I want us to see what Jesus sees in this text. See what Jesus sees in this particular text. Jesus sees some things. First of all, he sees the problems of ordinary people. Jesus sees the problems of ordinary people. He is one who lived his life just like you and I did. We read that in John chapter 1, verse 14 a couple of weeks ago. The Word became flesh, and he dwelled, he lived among us. We get this idea sometimes that Jesus, he sort of floated through life with this halo on his head, and the Holy One was here. That's not how Jesus lived. Jesus lived just like every other human lived life. And he was around ordinary people, and he did the ordinary things of life. He probably was a carpenter by trade. He might have even known some of these disciples that he first called and would have been around them and been friends with them previous to his calling of them. But as John 2 opens up, we see that he's attending a wedding in the region of Cana near his hometown. His family had obviously known this family, and they were invited to a wedding. Wedding ceremonies were part of a much larger wedding feast in the first century Jewish context. A feast would typically last, a wedding feast, as long as a week. So you would have the ceremonial parts, but then there would be celebration, and it wouldn't just be friends and close family. This was a big deal, and sometimes it would include an entire town as coming out to this and celebrating around the families that were involved in it. At feasts such as this, wine, although it was a daily drink, played a prominent role. There's social dynamics that are at play in this wedding. Aren't there social dynamics always at play in weddings? Right? Like, who's going to be in the wedding party? And we do not want to tick off certain friends by not including them in the wedding party. So there's obviously a social dynamic that goes into this. There's a social dynamic around the dress and how much we're going to spend on the dress and what the dress is going to speak about the bride. The families wrestle with how big to go on the reception, right? Like, how much are we going to spend? And with 2 daughters in my family, I'm a little worried about that as they get older. But there's these social dynamics because this is a big deal, and we're on display, and in a sense, we want to impress, right? I mean, that's part of what goes into a wedding. Because weddings involve social dynamics, They don't all, in the first century, they didn't just involve the social dynamics of the couple, but also the families in relationship to the people they had invited. This was a social event around two families that were coming together. And so there was a lot of, and in this culture, this is an honor-shame culture, there's a lot going into this event as these families worry about everything coming off just right. The town is watching. So to run out of wine would have brought a lot of shame on not only the couple. It wouldn't have just been a little bit embarrassing. It would have been shameful, and you could have lost honor, and you would have lost possibly even position within that town if you would offend in such a way as that. So for these families involved in this wedding, this was a big deal to run out of wine. Jesus sees this. He's there. He's around it. He's in the midst of it. This situation, running out of wine, definitely represents more of a physical, a worldly problem than a spiritual problem. But Jesus was there, witnessed, experienced, and saw the difficulties that these two families were going through. Jesus sees the problems of ordinary people. As believers in Jesus Christ, we have to keep in mind that God knows and God sees, and God is concerned even about the very basic daily needs of his people. There's a whole chapter basically in Matthew chapter 6 that goes into this, right? We worry about food, we worry about clothing, we worry about stuff, we worry about money. And Jesus reminds us, God sees that, and God knows that. And why worry about that? Take it to him in prayer. If he dresses the flowers of the field and he cares for the birds of the air, why would we think he doesn't see our needs? Jesus sees these needs. We must, though, keep these in balance and don't be consumed by such physical issues. But we must be reminded of the reality that God remains concerned for our day-to-day problems, and he remains concerned for the day-to-day needs of his children. These situations also represent a very powerful time for us to model and live out and demonstrate that we believe God cares for us and takes care of his children. Where do you turn when life gets difficult? Where do you turn when all of a sudden the pressures of job loss, and I know some of you are going through that, it's like all of a sudden that's ripped out from underneath you and you think you're going to go right into a new job and it'll be taken care of, but all of a sudden that starts going longer and longer and longer, and God, I got to provide for my family. God, I got to take care of the needs of my household. Where is that coming from? And we sometimes don't want to bring that up to others, and we don't want to burden others with it. But the reality is God sees that. God knows that. We can take it to him. God senses our daily needs. God sees the family troubles that we're going through. And again, we don't want to see others to see that, but God knows, and he's intimately involved with that. He cares about that. God knows the problems of ordinary people. Jesus was present to witness that. What we do in those times, how we show our dependence on him, will speak volumes about where our faith is, and it will model trust in Jesus Christ. But what do we tend to do? We tend to get frustrated. We tend to complain. We tend to focus on self. And we miss out on the opportunity to show Christ in the moment. This sounds just like a little one, but I've been challenged by this in a couple areas over my life, just in habits that I've formed in ordinary circumstances of life. And what am I modeling to my kids and my family and those around me when I go through those things? My kids joke with me that dad is, when he's driving, dad experiences road rage. I'm not an angry person. But it is true that in those moments when frustration comes, right? What comes out of what's within? It's something to vent. It's something to get frustrated with. It's something to complain about. And I know this sounds really stupid, and this is just a little illustration. But the fact that my kids see that come out demonstrates where my heart is at when I get frustrated or when somebody does something that I don't like. Because I'm never going to see that person. I'm never going to experience anything with them again. And so it's easy. This is like social media too, right? It's easy to just blast on them or let something out or vent on them because it's not going to really have any feedback to me. But why not in that moment, instead of lashing out, demonstrate my dependence on God, demonstrate my relationship on God, and use that to humble myself and talk about that with my kids and how I don't get frustrated with that because ultimately that's not what matters in life if I'm 2 minutes later than I want to be. But we do this, and it's not just with issues like that. It's all kinds of things where we have these teachable moments, and instead of modeling Christ and the fact that he sees and is involved in our ordinary life, we just blow through those things and live for self. I love the reality of the fact that Jesus is in this moment. He sees what's going on, and he knows this is going to bring big shame upon these people. And while we may think that we shouldn't bother God with these sorts of things, or God is above these sorts of things, understand that he knows and he sees all of our life. And he wants us to display dependence on him. Trust in him. He wants that comes out of this in those moments of stress to be testimony of where our hope is, because he's there. Jesus sees the problems of ordinary people, and he wants us to display our dependence on him while keeping his will first and foremost. And that's what Jesus sees secondly here. Not only the problems of ordinary people, but Jesus sees the primacy of God's will. They're invited to this wedding. They're there. The wine has run out. Jesus' mother says to him, they have no more wine. Mary is in the know. She sees what's going on and brings the difficulty to the attention of Jesus. Isn't it fascinating how guys really are never in the know, but the women are? I mean, even Jesus isn't in the know here, right? Like, he's off to the side. Mary's in the know. This is the thing about guys. We're never in the know, unless you're Jacques Cowart, right? Like, Jacques' always in the know. Jacques' watching this, I know, at some point today in Cyprus. So, I'm mocking you, Jacques. If you ever want the gossip, ask Jacques. He knows. I think he knows even what's going on in our church, even though he's in Cyprus right now. He's always in the know. But that was Mary. She was in the know on this, and she's involved in it. And so she sees the need, and she brings it to Jesus. The dynamics of this situation and dialogue between Mary and Jesus require a little bit of discussion. She comes and says to him, they have no more wine. And Jesus replies in verse 4, woman, why do you involve me? Or what has this to do with me? Now, the way that this reads in English, especially from our own cultural dynamics affecting how we read this, it makes Jesus sound at best as if he is dismissive of his mother here, or worse, that he is harsh and disrespectful to her. Woman, why are you bringing this to me? Now, that's our cultural dynamics from the way we hear this in English. That's not necessarily what Jesus was saying here. Woman as a means of address, that phrase woman, wasn't necessarily disrespectful, but it is interesting in this context that John refers to Mary 3 times in this context as the mother of Jesus. And the one time that Jesus addresses her, he doesn't address her as mother, he addresses her as woman. And I think John is pointing to something here, and that is he is distancing Jesus from the request by Mary. It's a distancing of himself from her request. It's as if Jesus is making a point that he is involved in something larger than the problem that is going on here, even though he recognizes what is happening. In fact, that's what I think the question that he asks does. What does this have to do with me? He's not dismissing the problem, nor the veiled request by Mary to do something, but he sees something much greater going on, and that is the point of what his ministry is about. It isn't yet his hour, and he says this, my hour has not come. Now in John, we're going to see this a number of times as we go through this gospel. Jesus' hour, when he refers to that, is a very significant phrase. He's referring to his time for the ultimate climax of his ministry, his death, and also his resurrection and his ascension and glorification. When Jesus speaks of the hour, it's looking forward to that. The point is, Jesus is focused ultimately on what his ministry is about, and that is what God has sent him to do. My hour is not yet come. Jesus suggests here that his ministry primarily centers on accomplishing the Father's will for his life. And his actions in this story are going to accomplish this will. It's not my time yet. I'm primarily about the will of my Father. Jesus' focus, even in the midst of the problems, is ultimately on what is God's will for this situation. What does he want to do? And so he draws attention off of the problem and ultimately on to his Father's will. His actions in this story are going to be done to accomplish his will rather than simply dealing with the problem of running out of wine at a wedding. For us, I think this challenges us to keep focused on God's will. What is of ultimate significance? And that is difficult in the midst of trying times, of hard times, of the pressures of this life. But as a believer in Jesus Christ, that's what we are called to be about, ultimately the accomplishment of God's will. Over the past couple of years, you've heard us speaking a lot about the convictions of this church. What are we about? And we've as elders, basically put out 5 of those for us. That we exist for the glory of God, right? That God is most glorified in Jesus Christ as the gospel, his good news of Jesus Christ, is believed by us, is obeyed by us, and is proclaimed. That the Holy Spirit then is creating a new kind of community to mirror Christ to this world. It's our 3rd conviction. Our 4th one is that we as believers and members of this body help one another thrive according to God's design for their lives. And 5thly, as we go out into this world, that we seek the good of our community through our hospitality, our work, and our service to point others to Jesus Christ. That's what we are about. That's God's will as we see it as leaders for our church. And we keep reminding ourselves of that because this is what God ultimately wants to accomplish in us. In the context of life's difficulties. And so, as life weighs us down with financial strain, as life weighs us down with frustration at job, as life weighs us down with family struggles, even as we're going through that, what God is calling us to do is keep focused ultimately on what his primary will is. That is his glory, that we trust in Jesus Christ and we proclaim him by how we act and respond in the midst of the difficulties of life. That's part of maturation, is to able to keep our attention on what ultimately matters. So are we children or are we maturing? Isn't that the big frustration with children? You can't keep their attention for more than about 30 seconds. Right? Focus on this. They focus, do-do-do-do-do, and all of a sudden, it's toddler, just watch them, and they just start wandering all over the place. It's impossible to keep them focused. But if we mature, as we grow, we're able to, our minds focus in on certain particular tasks and the matter that is at hand. Same thing as with us as children of God. As we mature in this, even as life throws us difficulties, even as life throws us distractions, rather than wandering after all of those things, we're able to keep our attention on what ultimately matters. That's what Jesus was about. Jesus sees primarily God's will. 3rd, Jesus sees the predicament, their predicament, requiring his grace. The response from Mary to Jesus' statement, Mary doesn't take this as some sort of harsh rebuke. That wasn't it at all. His mother said to the servants, do whatever he tells you. I don't think she fully understands what Jesus is saying to her, but she trusts that Jesus is going to do something, and she tells the servants to do whatever her son suggests. Mary remains confident here that Jesus would act in a loving and Jesus would act in a gracious manner. And that is exactly how Jesus responded in this situation. He saw the need. He saw the problem and addressed the need while pointing to something much greater. He saw the need and he acted out of love and he acted out of grace. As believers in Jesus Christ, we today need to model this attitude of Jesus through our own actions. When we see need around us, how do we respond? Do we come in with love? Are we responsive with grace? And sometimes that need might be a physical need, but sometimes that need is a spiritual need. And that person might live a lifestyle that we choose not to live, or that person might be living in sin. They might be totally blind to where that road is leading them. And what they need is a believer who comes into their life and models love and grace. That's what Jesus does here. He responds out of his love for these people and an act of grace toward them. A mark of the presence of Jesus in one's life is that the needs of others are noticed, that he sees their need, he addresses it with grace. And ultimately, a mark of us as followers of him is that we point to the greater reality of our hope in Jesus. Jesus wasn't above helping those in need. This is the Son of God. This is Israel's Messiah. This is the one who has to come and teach and do all of these sorts of other things. But he's not above helping those who are in need, even in the ordinary problems of life. He had a greater mission, but he accomplished it through addressing a basic human problem while transforming the situation to point to himself as the answer to the ultimate human dilemma. That's where we want to go next. Jesus sees, yes, our daily ordinary problems. Jesus focuses primarily on his Father's will, and he recognizes the predicament requiring his grace. But I don't want us to just see what Jesus sees. I want us also from this text today to see what Jesus transforms. In reading a story, you always want to pay attention to what the storyteller gives and spends time on. You know, sometimes you're watching a movie or reading a book and you're like, why is he showing us that? Right? Like that doesn't seem to match up. And yet there's always foreshadowing, there's always hints, there's always building of things that are important to the ultimate storyline or the ultimate purpose, whether it's a novel that we're reading or a movie that we're watching. It's fascinating to me in this story that only takes 10 verses to tell. John gives an entire verse. He doesn't talk about the bride. He doesn't talk about all of the other stuff. He talks about these jars, right? In verse 6, nearby stood 6 stone water jars, the kind used by the Jews for ceremonial washing, each holding from 20 to 30 gallons. Well, all this detail about these jars. John highlights these stone jars that were used for purification. What would happen is they would fill these jars with water, and once they were filled and they were blessed, they were considered pure. It's important that they're stone because clay jars, especially if they weren't fired in a kiln, could become unclean or impure. And so for ceremonial washing, you would put things in stone jars because that could not become unclean. So as these stone jars are there, these are the kinds of things that a servant, as you would walk into the wedding, would take a little bit of a ladle out and pour some on your hands. You could wash your hands, and therefore now you are ceremonially what? Clean. That's what they were there for, to do at the wedding. Jesus uses these stone jars to teach and demonstrate a much greater reality at work in this text. Jesus here transforms vessels for purification into vessels for celebration. Jesus demonstrated that he was the unique Son of God by performing a miracle of turning water into wine. But the point isn't the miracle. Notice, it doesn't tell us anything about how he did this miracle. It just says that he told them to fill these jars up and then take some out to the master of the feast. And when the master drank it, it had turned into wine. Jesus is teaching through this action that the one who could bring ultimate purification was present at this wedding as well. Purification doesn't come, people, through water jars. I'm here, is what Jesus is saying. And if I'm here, there's no need for purification jars. Let's just turn those into wine jars for celebration. And that's exactly what Jesus does. He takes these vessels for purification and turns them into vessels for celebration, because the work of Jesus purifies us so that we can celebrate. There's no more need for purification washing. The point to purification washing is standing in your midst. And he does away with the necessity of that ritual. In the performance of this miracle, Jesus ends the further need of purification. There is no more need to wash hands because the one who permanently purifies is present. All that is left to do is to celebrate. Those stone jars represent what the law and all of its purification rites was about. That you would constantly and continually have to go through these actions to make yourself pure. Once Jesus comes, that's all done. The work of Jesus purifies us so that we can celebrate. We don't have to get caught up in trying to keep regulations and do things to make ourselves pure with God. If we're in Jesus Christ, we are purified once for all. I think this challenges us to stop trying to make ourselves right with God through our own efforts. It is one thing to do deeds and actions and right works out of a heart of gratitude and praise to God, but we need to realize that our efforts in no way have anything to do with making us right with God. Jesus does that. Jesus transforms the law. Jesus fulfills the law. Jesus completes the law, and therefore those who are in him are purified. That should be cause for celebration. I don't have to do anything. I am right with God because of Jesus, as I believe in Jesus. But when you and I make it about our own efforts, when we try to see ourselves through our deeds as having to please God and make ourselves right with God, we enter back into the drudgery of that old system. Jesus says, celebrate. That's over. We don't have to do that anymore because I came. Not only does Jesus transform vessels for purification into vessels for celebration, but Jesus transforms an ordinary wedding into a foretaste of the ultimate wedding feast. I love how the story ends where they take the water that has turned into wine to the master of the banquet, and when he tasted that water that had been turned into wine, he did not realize where it had come from, though the servants who had drawn the water knew. Then he called the bridegroom aside and said, everyone brings out the choice wine first and then the cheaper wine after the guests have had too much to drink, but you have saved the best till now. Jesus instructs these servants to take the drink from the jars to the master of the feast. This was probably a guest who had been invited, but was also sort of the master of ceremonies. He's there to make sure everything goes well. They didn't have female wedding coordinators. They had male wedding coordinators in the first century, I guess. That's what's going on here, right? This guy's there to make sure everything behind the scenes falls right into place. He would be in big trouble if this wine runs out at this wedding, because this is going to reverberate back to him. And Jesus tells these servants, take this to him. And in another irony in this story, the one in charge of all the goings-on has less information as to what is really happening than his own servants do, right? The servants know what's happening. The guy in charge has no clue. But when he tastes the wine, he calls for the bridegroom, and he praises him for choosing and saving such choice wine. Who would be in charge of this, to choose that? It would be the bridegroom's responsibility to pay for and provide for the feast. And so the master of ceremonies comes, the master of the feast comes, and he just lavishes praise. But guess what? The bridegroom has nothing to say, because did the bridegroom present any of this? No, he failed. And it's another irony that's going on in this story is that the master of the banquet unknowingly gives credit to Jesus, the one doing all the work at the wedding, the one providing the best wine at the wedding. That's not the master of the feast or the bridegroom, it's Jesus. Jesus transforms an ordinary wedding into a foretaste of his ultimate wedding feast because the work of Jesus demonstrates that he is the true master of ceremonies and he is the true bridegroom. The bridegroom doesn't say anything because he made no provision for the wine. It isn't about him. Rather, it's about Jesus. I think as we see that and apply that truth to our lives today, we give so much importance and we lavish so much praise on human celebrity and on human fame. And even in our social media world, think about it. We want to garner what? Followers. And the more of those we get, the more prominent or the more famous we are. It's fascinating how that speaks into our children's lives. And Jill, you gave me that illustration a couple weeks ago, right? About your grandson, and you're walking on the beach with him, and somebody points out this little house on the beach and says, who was living there? Jill has no idea. Yeah, I know. She got no idea. I didn't know who this guy was either. But the guy mentions his name, and Jill's like, who is that? And her little grandson goes, oh, I know who that is. He's got millions of followers on YouTube, and I watch him all the time. See, Jill can't even remember. This is the problem with the distancing of age from social media. But it's the reality of that, right? We lavish, and our younger people are just tuned into that stuff. And it weighs on them, and I want to speak this just for a minute to the young people. Don't buy into the lie that what ultimately is important is how many followers you can garner or how many people are paying attention to you. What ultimately isn't important is not your fame. It's the fame of Jesus Christ. He is the celebrity. He is the ultimate famous one, and he's replacing himself in this wedding. This should have been about the bridegroom. This should have been about the master of ceremonies, and they totally are left out of the scene because the one who ultimately everything is about is present. And through this miracle, Jesus provides a foretaste of the ultimate wedding feast that will take place, where he will be front and he will be center as the true bridegroom. Jesus transforms, and this is the theme of this message, that Jesus transforms the problems and the difficulties of ordinary life into celebratory displays of his glory. The last verse in chapter 2 summarizes this first miracle, and it says a lot. What Jesus did here in Cana of Galilee was the first of the signs through which he revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. John indicates here in verse 11 that this miracle was the beginning of the signs that Jesus did. It was the beginning of the signs that he performed. Some miracles in John and in the Gospels were referred to as works. Jesus did these works, but this one is called a sign. Even in the movie, they got this wrong. They called it a miracle. It's not called a miracle. It's a sign. John's going to use that expression a few times in this Gospel at very key junctures. This idea of sign isn't a simple miracle nor an illustration of his power, but listen to how the commentator C.K. Barrett describes a sign. A sign in John is a symbolic anticipation or a showing forth of a greater reality. It's a symbolic anticipation of a greater reality. This wedding feast is a sign of a much greater reality, that there is an ultimate wedding feast that is coming, and the true bridegroom, Jesus Christ, will be what that's all about. And you, if he turned water into wine and made all of that celebration, you definitely don't want to miss the ultimate wedding feast. That's the sign that John gives us. This anticipation of that greater reality. Jesus reveals his glory through this. And Jesus addressed the ordinary problems of life by transforming this situation into a display of his glory. If we are seeking to live life and reflect Christ to this world, if we want to do that, and that's what we want our church to be about, that they see Christ in us, then I think there are a couple of takeaways from this point in how we can apply it to our life today. And I'll just rip through these right at the very end. Don't, first of all, be too proud to bring your needs to Jesus. Don't be too proud to bring your needs to Jesus. It's just a simple little problem. Everybody struggles with this. Yes, they do. We read those list of requests that our young people had, right? And you could even sense in some of those a frustration and a timidness to, I don't know that I really want to share this with others. And some of those are the very longings and achings of their heart. But the reality for us and the takeaway for us from this sermon is don't be afraid to take those needs and those hurts and those longings and those wants to Jesus because he sees them. Secondly, trust that he knows best. Trust that he knows best. We can get frustrated with God. Why isn't he answering him when I need him to? But know that God is never late. God never acts hastily. God never gets rushed. God has his timing. God knows his will, and he wants it for your life. And just because you're not sensing his answering right now does not mean that he fails to care. As we bring our requests to him and we trust that he knows best, he will show what is truly important. He will transform through his helping of us, and he'll help us. He'll transform our thinking on this and help us to discern what are those things in life, those physical things in life that are only temporary, and what are those things in life that are ultimately eternal that you need to be about. As we go to him, as we trust in him, know that he cares about us more than we can ever imagine. Third, allow him to do what he decides to do. Mary lets Jesus, whatever he says, do it. And Jesus places himself in the center and displays his glory. John Klink, in his commentary on this, says this: placing God at the center is ultimately the best self-seeking decision a Christian can make. We're not to seek our own interests, right? But placing God at the center is ultimately the best self-seeking decision a Christian can make. It is to have thy will be done as the backdrop of every thought and as the motor of every decision. When we place God's will and God at the center of our lives, his will be done takes precedent over our own will. Allow him to do what he decides. This is a Christ-centered posture. Allow him to do what he decides to do. And lastly, whatever the outcome, continue to point back to the eternal hope that you have in him. Whatever the outcome of the situation, it might not get answered the way you want. But when we trust him and when we take our needs to him and we allow his will to be done, not our will, whatever the outcome then is, we can point back to our eternal hope in him. This might not have gone the way I wanted, but that's not what ultimately is important. I'm being transformed to look like Jesus Christ, and if God says that's not his will to do this in my life, that's okay. My trust is that he knows better. And I'm going to live and order my life in that direction. Just thinking back on a funeral that we had a couple of almost a month ago now with the passing of Dana, right? Dana Grady, about half a month ago. But Dana prayed and he prayed and he prayed and he wanted us to pray and pray and pray for what? His healing. But even as time started going along and it became more and more evident that Dana was not going to be healed, did that cause Dana to give up on Jesus Christ? No. It only furthered his hope in Jesus Christ, that I might be getting taken out of here. And guess what? I get to go into that waiting room where the hors d'oeuvres are being served for that ultimate wedding feast, right? I'm getting that much closer to that reality because I will be with Jesus Christ. That's where our hope is, folks. He's the ultimate bridegroom. This life isn't about us, it's about His will being done. And can we, in the midst of difficulties, take those difficulties to Him, trust His will be done, know that He's going to transform even our difficulties to display His glory so that He gets the credit. When we trust that, we live our life that way, that points to Him. That's where transformation is going to take place. Let's close in a word of prayer this morning. Lord, we just thank You for this passage. There's so much going on in this miracle story that, God, we just rip through it and we see, hey, water turned to wine. That's really awesome that Jesus could do that. Yes, it was, but there's so much more. It shows us Your heart, God, that you do see and You're intricately involved in the problems and the difficulties and the frustrations of our life. You respond to them so graciously. But ultimately, God, You want to display Your glory by accomplishing Your will, Your eternal will in the midst of that. So God, I pray today that You would transform hearts in this congregation. Maybe there's some that are gathered here today that haven't seen Jesus for who He truly is. They haven't been transformed. They haven't come to Him, but through their own efforts, through their own choices, through their own decisions, through their own life, they're looking and placing their faith and trying to earn their way into right relationship with You. God, they're as useless as the water in stone jars was at this wedding, because all of that's been transformed by Jesus Christ. He is the one who purifies. And so, God, I pray that You would purify hearts this morning. Save some that haven't come to a place where they've trusted Him. But God, for those of us who are believers, help us to not place our hope, to get our eyes off of, Lord, this present world. What this world is putting forward to us as fame, what this world is putting forward to us as celebrity of what is important, and recognize that the true bridegroom, the ultimate master of the feast, has come. He's brought salvation, and we are to order our lives in anticipation of His great wedding feast. God, may we be a church that is about that. May we be individuals as we believe that, as we trust that bring our requests to You, that trust in You. And no matter what the outcome, that our hope is in Jesus Christ. And whatever this world does to us, we are moving closer to that great feast where we can only celebrate and bask in His glory. Thank You, Jesus, for our salvation. And may You transform us as we live our lives out in dependence on You, seeking Your will to display Your glory, Your grace, as we live it out this week. We pray this in Jesus' name.